I'm joined now by Athol Fugard, South Africa's most prolific and preeminent playwright. Since the 1950s, Fugard has written more than 30 plays, including The Road to Mecca, Valley's Song, Bozeman and Lena, and Master Harold and the Boys, which won the Drama Desk Award for Outstanding Play when it premiered in 1982. Fugard was awarded the Order of Ikhamanga in Silver for his excellent contribution and achievements in the theater from the government of South Africa in 2005, and his novel, Tsatsi, was adapted into an Academy Award-winning film that same year. Athol Fugard, welcome to LA Theatre Works, and thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be talking to you. Thank you very much.
When and how did you first begin writing plays?
It was in my late teens that I already knew that in some form or the other, words on paper were going to be what my life was going to be about. And in fact, my first attempts at writing went the usual well-beaten route of poetry and novels and short stories, because where I grew up in Port Elizabeth, there was virtually no theatre, so that didn't really exist in terms of a possibility for me. It was only later when I moved to a big city that I discovered that that was an option as well. And the moment I discovered it, I found that it was exactly right for my chemistry as a writer.
Do you have any memory of the first play you ever saw in the theatre?
The first play I ever saw in the theatre was, I think, a very boring production of Shakespeare, and it's rather damaged my perception of that great writer ever since. I must admit.
But it didn't dampen your ardor for writing for the theatre.
No, on the contrary, I took to it like a fish to water. I really did it. You see, it's a question of the spoken word, of language, the dialogue, what happens to language in people's mouths, how we use it to either tell our secrets or hide our secrets, because we use language in both ways. So that is what I feel I am as a writer. That's what I'm equipped to be able to do. And the moment I stumble upon the possibility of a story, I immediately think in dialogue terms and in terms of the structure of a stage play.
Were you raised in the spirit of activism? Was social justice instilled in you by either of your parents?
Oh, yes. It was a rather difficult situation because I loved both mother and father. My father was, in a mild way, something of a racial bigot. But my mother was this extraordinary woman who, somehow just gifted from birth by God with a sense of social justice and of the fact that, all human beings were entitled to the best that life had to offer. And she was the one really who shaped my outlook. I mean, the play of mine, Master Harold and the Boys, in fact, in a way reflects something of that. It doesn't say very much about my mother, but it does reflect the fact that, I had a very complex and troubled relationship with my father, who I loved very much.
What are the challenges of taking deeply personal stories and making them universal?
Well, the first thing I think I tell young writers when I meet them is that don't ever think in terms of the universal, because if you're going to start writing for a universal audience, you're going to end up being very anemic, bloodless. Write for a specific time and a specific audience. And that has always been my first impulse as a writer. And in fact, it is given what I think is the best definition of me as a writer, which is a regional playwright. I am as regional. I don't mean to flatter myself by comparisons, but if you look at a writer like, for example, Tennessee Williams, or a playwright, or if you want to think of a prose writer like Faulkner, both of them were intensely regional writers. Southern writers. And they certainly didn't think in terms of universals. Those plays are sort of addressed, you have a sense of them. The novels of Faulkner and the plays of Williams are addressed to specific audiences in his time.
When you were growing up in South Africa, at what point did you understand the power of theater to engage people?
Let me put it this way. My social conscience was already there in place when that moment of understanding came. And that moment of understanding actually came when a group of black men and women, a small group, about 5 of them, when they trooped into my life one evening in the little apartment I was staying in Port Elizabeth with my wife and child. And they had come because they'd heard about my success with a play called The Blood Knot. Mm-hmm. Local boy makes good. It was, a big story in all the local newspapers in Port Elizabeth. And they had come to ask me to help them establish a drama group. And at first my inclination was just to say, no, please, leave me alone. I want to write my next play. I'm busy writing my next play, in fact. But, guilty conscience, makes a liberal of any man. And I said, all right, let's try. And it was then in working with that drama group, with those black people, that I became to realize that they had come to me and that they wanted to start a theatre group because they saw theatre as a way of having a voice in a society in which they had no voice at all. Nobody was listening to them. Nobody heard what their grievances were. Nobody understood the desperation in their hearts, how much they longed for better things in life. And it was an awesome realization that theatre could in fact do that for people. That really is the start, I suppose, if you're going to talk about any sort of political commitment in my writing. That was the start of it.
What was the experience of running an integrated theater in that period like for you? What were some of the challenges? Were you ever fearful? Were you afraid they were going to close you down?
Oh, well, it had all sorts of very, very hard consequences in terms of my life. Our telephones were tapped, our house was searched in the middle of the night. They were real bullies in terms of the way they dealt with me, real aggressive, intimidating nonsense. But the worst, of course, was for the black actors who worked with me. They were subjected to some much more hands-on brutality. I mean, several members of that group, of the founding members of that drama group, ended up on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. And it was out of those experiences of that group that I devised that play, The Island, which together with Sizwe Bonzi is Dead has enjoyed phenomenal success over the years and still gets done from time to time.
Getting back to Master Harold, you wrote that play in 1982 around your 50th birthday. What was it about that time in your life that inspired you to write Master Harold?
For many years prior to the actual writing of the play, I knew I wanted to do something by way of celebrating the presence of those 2 remarkable black men who had been in my life from the time I was a young boy. 2 black men who, in fact, with their unutterable decency, their compassion, and their understanding of my own tormented situation, were role models for me and provided me with an image of decent male masculinity that I didn't have. I needed a father figure who would be a role model, and my own dad, as much as I loved him, because that is at the core of Master Harold and the Boys. But it was an impulse on my side to celebrate those 2 men. I just felt I had an obligation because my debt of gratitude to them was so great.
Why do you think families are such a good framework for exploring the issues around apartheid?
The first battleground in which ideas about right and wrong, good and evil, justice and injustice play out, the first battleground is the family. You know, that's the battleground, to put it mildly. That's where we make our first discoveries about what power means and how power can be abused and used. There was I, a little white boy, barely in my teens, still in short trousers, being able to bully two mature adult black men and treat them like servants, like inferiors, simply by virtue of my having a white skin.
Master Harold was banned from performance in South Africa for a time. Tell us about the circumstances around the ban and how it was eventually lifted.
I'd been expecting that play to run foul of censorship from the moment I wrote it. I must tell you that there were many times in the course of the writing of it when I almost censored myself, which is a terrible thing for a writer to do. But I woke up to that danger in time and stopped myself and wrote what I felt had to be written. But I knew that the play was going to run into trouble. And sure enough, one of the ways they were trying to stop the production of the play was in virtue of the strict zoning laws in South Africa, which said that certain areas, institutions, and public occasions were reserved for people of one race only. And there was my play wanting to put together black men and a white boy on a stage. And they used that aspect of the law to threaten us and to try and derail the production. Our lawyers found a loophole, which we were able to exploit, defy them, and proceed with the production.
Do you remember what the loophole was?
Yes, I think it was to the effect that was true if it was a totally public event. What we did then was structure our production and our run of the play so that it was, in the sense, a private club to which every member of the audience became a member when they bought a ticket. And we got away with it.
What, in your opinion, are the challenges for the South Africa of today versus the South Africa of Master Harold?
Well, it's a good question, but my word, that's it. It invites a university PhD dissertation in reply. Because, firstly, apartheid is not really dead yet. Racial prejudice, even forms of xenophobia, are simmering under the surface in that country still. So that is one issue we haven't, for all our talk about our Rainbow Nation, for all of the wonderful work of Reverend Bishop Desmond Tutu, and of course the extraordinary Nelson Mandela. But we are far from being the democracy that we set out to be. And if we're not careful, we're not going to get there. And I think that this new society, our new South Africa, needs the vigilance of writers every bit as much as did the old one, the old apartheid South Africa.
Thank you, Athol Fugard, so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure.
I've been speaking with Athol Fugard, the author of Master Harold and the Boys.